Hi guys, welcome to Laptop Jewel. I am Tiffany. Thank you to all my royal, loyal, regular diggers. Thank you so much to you that might just be joining, or might you just thought you saw something and you're like, actually, let me see. I hope you stay and you like what you see and you join the notification gang so that every time Laptop Jewel uploads, you get notified. Listen, yo, Laptop Jewel just dropped a new video. So I've not been talking about a series. It's not going to be a very long series, but some sort of series, right? In terms of idolatry, somehow God was really just speaking to me so much about idolatry in June. So I thought, you know what? I really feel like I want to make it a series. So what are idols, right? I think first and foremost, we need to get an understanding of what idols really are, right? So idols are anything, right? Anything, any person, right? That can be attributed to God or can be made to take the place of God, but is not the true God, right? I was listening to a video by Jackie Perry Hill. Oh yeah, I'll just put it down here so that you guys have a sense of what I'm talking about. And she was basically talking about how idolatry comes from us as humans trying to fill, right, a void, trying to fill something, right, that we kind of don't want God to fill, but we are allowing things, other people, right, to actually such a confirmation. So basically I watched Jackie's video a while ago, and then I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and I had already done my study like after that, right? And obviously I did it like from kind of was very in depth, right? In depth to an extent, because I wanted to first kind of understand where it started from, where it came from, and how we got to this point, right? And which was so fun and so interesting, but such a confirmation as well, that when I went to go and watch her video for the second time, basically she used the same passage of scripture that was in my notes, which was like such a confirmation from God as well. But basically the reason also why we tend to go to idolatry, right, is because as humans we are so fixated on the things that we want to see. Hence we are always working towards always, and hence it is so difficult for us to understand that our faith is by grace and not by our own works, because what we always just want to work and do something and get something, right? That when we understand that, oh my goodness, that our faith is actually by grace, that nothing we can ever do, it somehow, it's very mind-boggling to many, right? And so we tend to basically find objects or people or things that we can see that is some form of a representation of a God, right? But is not the true God. But we put it in the place of who God is or who God should be in our lives, right? And it was very interesting. The first, I guess, story around the whole like an idol was mentioned in Genesis 31 verse 19, and just basically like a recap or just like a summary basically. So Rachel, who was Jacob's wife, right, as they were leaving, because Jacob decided to take his wife and kids, she decided to basically steal her father's idol. I guess the story around the whole, idol. And imagine, I think as much as Laban was angry at Jacob, the thing that drove him to basically go and run and find these people was the idol, right? And sometimes our minds and our hearts are so set on these idols that we make, you know. And sometimes people think idols are like, you know, like the usual idolatry that we hear about, but it can be something so small. And I think as God was ministering to me this month, June, in terms of idolatry, I had to check in my heart and really introspect what are idols. And obviously it's very difficult to just be like, oh my goodness, God, you know. But it is important that we realize, or that we introspect and see what are the idols in our lives that are taking the place of God. So for example, you know, we live in a time where it is so where we are so consumed with we are so consumed with things and materialistic things, you know, something as the time that we spend on our phones, the time that we spend watching Netflix, the time that we spend, you know, those take time that we are supposed to be spending on God, right? Some of the unhealthy. I also wanted to understand, I guess, you know, what idol would mean in Hebrew. The word that I was getting was atsafim, atsavim, right? And it usually brings great suffering and pain. So sometimes we don't see how these idols actually cost us. And obviously, as I go through this, we'll eventually see the consequences of us placing things and people in the place of God, right? And because of that, what happens is punishment comes because we are being disobedient. Now, the passage of scripture that I'm going to be focusing on today is in Exodus 32. So basically what happens is Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, right? And it was so funny because when I went through this and I read, I've really just been so intrigued about how the Israelites think, because they are so similar to us as humans, you know. But anyways, so basically Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and obviously he has encounters with God, and it takes time because God is speaking and God is revealing. And while Moses is in God's presence in Mount Sinai, the Israelites down there are getting a bit impatient, right? And they somehow want a substitute, right? I think I'm just gonna read a few so that it doesn't seem like I'm just, you know, taking things from nowhere. So Exodus 32 verse 1 says, when people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So sometimes, you know, we want to make decisions based on temporary circumstances that might have an effect long term. Sure. Right? So what happened was they got impatient and they saw, you know what, like we need a way out, right? And what was the need they were trying to fulfill was being led, right? And they tried to make a god because they wanted to be led. 7, then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have become, this is verse 8, they have become quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an goodness. And Moses, you know, left, and basically they lost hope. And sometimes when we go through certain seasons in our lives, we tend to lose hope and we find alternatives that take the place of God. Sometimes we take for granted what God has done, and when we don't see or it doesn't feel like it anymore, we tend to make these idols, and sometimes we lose ourselves within these idols. At the effects of idolatry, firstly, God's anger leads to punishment. We see in Leviticus 26 verse 1, it talks about God being a jealous God, right? He doesn't want us to be worshiping other idols. He wants us to worship him and only him, because he is the true God. I'm going to give you a few scriptures. Jeremiah 32 verse 1 to 23, it calls It talks about your possessions that get taken away. Why? Because of idolatry. Jeremiah 13 verse 20, it talks about destruction, that because of the idolatry, destruction comes there. Jeremiah 2 verse 26 to 28 talks about disgrace. God allows the enemy we've been serving to have his way and bring shame and disgrace over our lives. Jeremiah 36 verse 1 to 7 talks about pain, that because of our idolatry, God will allow pain into our lives. Lastly, Isaiah 2 verse 12 talks about it leads to pride. God is calling for humility, but sometimes also idolatry can be where we idolize ourselves, right? And we become prideful. So when things happen, we tend to praise ourselves instead of God. And those were basically the effects of idolatry. I hope somehow that this message has blessed someone out there about idolatry, right? What it does, what it is, right? And the effects of idolatry. Wow, this is Laptop Tutorial. If you are new, please make sure you do the right thing and you like, share, subscribe, and join the notification gang. I hope this message has blessed you. Please share it with someone that might need it, and have a blessed week further.